All right, so here we're going to cover some more information on qualitative research design, including naturalistic observation, as well as some sampling techniques that fit underneath qualitative research. So naturalistic observation will take place in the field. So you're going out and observing participants in their natural, normal, everyday setting. We're collecting data as we observe their normal, everyday lives. Before going into the field, researchers that are conducting naturalistic observations must define the scope of the research. The researcher may want to study everything about the people in the chosen setting, but this may not be realistic given the complexities of human behavior. As a result, the researcher must focus observations on the specific behaviors and responses that they're most interested in studying. So for example, the researcher might choose to collect quantitative data by counting the number of times a specific behavior occurs. But if the researcher is interested in the dog owner's interactions with their dogs, they might tally the number of times the owner talks to their dog during a walk. On the other hand, much of the data collected during naturalistic observation, including notes, audio, video recordings, and interviews, are the qualitative side to the data that's being collected. This requires that the researcher describes, analyzes, and interprets the information that's being observed. We can also use different types of sampling techniques when we conduct naturalistic observations. And so the time sampling techniques, this means that the researcher will observe participants at different levels of intervals of time. So these intervals can be random, they could be specific. So if the researcher wanted to decide only to observe subjects every morning for an hour, that would be the intervals of time. So they'd go out every morning, Monday through Friday, only on the weekends, whatever it is that they're looking for, and just choose an hour that morning to observe. When we look at event sampling, the researcher only records specific behaviors and they ignore everything else. So if they're observing interactions between kids playing on a playground, the researcher might decide that they're only interested in observing how children decide to take turns on the slide, and they're not going to watch anything else about what's going on that playground or anything else with that equipment, and they're only looking at kids, taking turns on that slide. Event sampling or situation sampling, we sometimes call it. The researcher observes the same, oh no, I'm sorry, I said event sampling again, didn't I? Situation sampling or individual sampling. This is where the researcher observes the same participants in various situations. So they'll look at one person at a time, or a small group of people at a time. And so like if they wanted to see like one of the big box office movies comes out, right? Like the latest Star Wars or superhero movie or something comes out, and they want to see how the fans respond to the release of the movie. So they go to the red carpet, the movie's premiere, and they're watching the fans' behavior. So they're looking at individual people and seeing how the fans are reacting, during the movie premiere, during the screenings and on the red carpet, and maybe they're looking at message boards and things like that to see how individuals are reacting to, the new movie that's being released. So those are some examples of sampling for naturalistic observations. Conducting the study in a natural setting essentially means that you're simply observing your subjects in their real life environment. You have no way of influencing what your subjects are doing. This method can be time consuming to gather information that you're specifically trying to obtain for your research project, but alternatively, the data that's collected in a natural setting does have more accuracy in reflecting real life behavior than what we see in a contrived behavior. A contrived setting is one where the specific situation being studied is created by the observer. So the contrived setting offers you, the observer, greater control over gathering of data, and specifically will enable you to gather the information more quickly and efficiently. However, it may be questionable as to whether or not the data collected does truly reflect a real-life situation. So unobtrusive observation is when the experimenter simply just sits back and watch. They take notes of the behavior, either in a natural or laboratory setting, without any kind of interaction at all between the experimenter and the subject or participant. So this is opposite, obviously, of an obtrusive observation in which the experimenter directly interacts with the subject. For example, in a social environment, the experimenter makes eye contact, they smile at the individual walking by to watch for a response. But in an unobtrusive observation, the experimenter would simply watch the way the subject responds to other people, but does not deliberately smile to watch for a response. And then there's 3 types of this: indirect measures, content analysis, and secondary analysis, which are covered in the next few slides. So an indirect measure is an unobtrusive measure that occurs naturally in a research context. And so the researcher is able to collect the data without introducing any type of formal measurement procedure. So the types of indirect measures that may be available are limited only by the researcher's imagination or inventiveness to go out and collect the data. So if you wanted to measure the popularity of various exhibits in a museum, you could possibly set up some type of mechanical measurement system that's invisible to the museum patrons, right? In one study, the system was simple. The museum installed new floor tiles in front of each exhibit. They wanted a measurement on and after a period of time that measured the wear and tear of the tiles as an indirect measure of patron traffic and interest. And so by measuring the wear and tear of the tiles, that they were able to track how long or how often people passed by that exhibit compared to, other exhibits, and how quickly the tiles wore in front of other exhibits. We might be able to improve on this approach considerably using electronic measures. We could, for instance, construct an electrical device that senses movement in front of an exhibit. We could place hidden cameras and code patron interest based on videotaped evidence. So there's a lot of ideas and stuff that we could do to gather and collect data without people being aware that we're even doing so. And then there's a couple more examples here on the slide of the radio station one, as well as the magazine preference one. In any of these examples, one of the most important points about indirect measures is that you have to be very careful about the ethics of this type of measurement. In an indirect measure, you're by definition collecting information without the respondent's knowledge. In doing so, you may be violating their right to privacy, and you're certainly not using informed consent. Of course, some types of information may be public and therefore not involve an invasion of privacy. There may be times when an indirect measure is appropriate, readily available, and ethical, but just as with all measurement, you have to be sure to attempt to estimate the reliability and validity of the measures. So collecting radio station preferences at 2 different time periods and correlating the results might be useful for assessing test and retest reliability, or you can include the indirect measure along with other direct measures of the same construct, perhaps in a pilot study to help establish a construct validity. So you can see here that using content analysis can be done with quantitative, qualitative, or as a mixed methods study. It's a very broad area of research. We do this through the thematic analysis of text, indexing, or the quantitative descriptive analysis. But content analysis has several problems that you should keep in mind. First, you're limited to the types of information available in text form. So if you're studying the way a news story is being handled by the news, you probably would have a ready population of news stories from which you could sample. However, if you're interested in studying people's views of capital punishment, you're less likely to find an archive or text documents that would be appropriate. Second, you have to be especially careful with sampling in order to avoid bias. For instance, a study of current research on methods of treatment for cancer might use published literature as the population. This would leave out both the writing on cancer that did not get published for one reason or another, as well as the most recent work that has not yet been published. And finally, you have to be careful about interpreting results of automated content analysis. A computer program cannot determine what someone meant by a term or phrase. It's relatively easy in a large analysis to misinterpret a result because you did not take into account the subtitles of meaning. However, content analysis has the advantage of being unobtrusive, and depending on whether automated methods exist, can be a relatively rapid method for analyzing large amounts of text. So secondary analysis often involves combining information from multiple databases to examine research questions. For example, you might join crime data with census information to assess patterns in criminal behavior by geographic location and group. It has several advantages. First, it's very efficient. It makes use of data that were already collected by somebody else. It is the research equivalent of recycling. Second, it often allows you to extend the scope of your study considerably. In many small research projects, it's impossible to consider taking a national sample because of the costs involved. Many archive databases are already national in scope, and by using them, you can leverage a relatively small budget into a much broader study than if you collected the data yourself. However, secondary analysis is not without difficulties. So frequently, it is no trivial matter to assess and link data from large, complex databases. Often the researcher has to make assumptions about what data to combine and which variables are appropriately aggregated into indexes. Perhaps more importantly, when you use data collected by others, you often don't know what problems occurred in the original data collection. Large, well-financed national studies are usually documented quite thoroughly, but even detailed documentation of procedures is often no substitute for direct experience collecting data. One of the most important and least utilized purposes of secondary analysis is to replicate prior research findings. In any original data analysis, there's the potential for errors. Each data analyst tends to approach the analysis from their own perspective using analytic tools that they're familiar with. In most research, the data are analyzed only once by the original research team. Data that might have taken months or years to collect is only examined once in a relatively brief way and from one analyst's perspectives. In social research, we generally do a terrible job of documenting and archiving the data from individual studies and making these available in electronic form for others to reanalyze. We tend to give little professional credit to studies that are reanalysis. Nevertheless, though, in the hard sciences, the tradition of replicability of results is a critical one, and we in the applied social sciences could benefit by directing more of our efforts to secondary analysis of the existing data. So as we continue to conduct this naturalistic observation and break down the behaviors that we're observing and put them into different categories, we need to focus on the inter-rater reliability. This is sometimes also called inter-observer reliability. This measures the degree of agreement between people observing or assessing the same thing. We use this when data is collected by researchers assigning ratings, scores, or categories to one or more variables. In an observational study where a team of researchers collect data on classroom behavior, reliability is important so that all the researchers should agree on how to categorize or rate different types of behavior. People are subjective, so different observers' perceptions of situations naturally differ. Reliable research aims to minimize subjectivity as much as possible so that a different researcher could replicate the same results. When designing the scale and criteria for data collection, it's important to make sure that different people will rate the same variable consistently with as minimal bias as possible. This is especially important when there are multiple research involved in data collection or analysis. To measure inter-rater reliability, different researchers conduct the same measurement or observation on the same sample, and then you can calculate the correlation between the different sets of results. If all the researchers give similar ratings, then the test has high inter-rater reliability. A team of researchers observe the progress of wound healing in patients. To record the stages of healing, rating scales are used, with a set of criteria to assess various aspects of the wounds. The results of different researchers assessing the same set of patients are compared, and there's a strong correlation between all sets of results, so the test has high inter-rater reliability. If we want to improve inter-rater reliability, we need to clearly define the variables and the methods that are used to measure them, develop detailed objective criteria for how the variables will be rated, counted, or categorized, and then if multiple researchers are involved, ensure that they all have exactly the same information as well as training. When we quantify the observations, we split them into different methods, such as the interval, frequency, duration, and latency. And so this is to break down ways in which we can collect the information. The frequency recording method involves counting and recording the number of times a behavior happens within a specific time frame. We do this a lot with like ABA therapy, which is what we do with children that have autism during treatment. So if we're observing their behaviors, the therapist or the clinician, we might record the number of times a behavior happens within a specific time frame, such as the child banging their head or their fist against the desk or a wall, how many times a student bites their pencil with an eraser, some type of behavior like that. The clinician or professional can determine how problematic an issue is and then come up with the best course of action to take for a specific behavioral issue. It can also help prove the value of treatment models over time. This type of recording is useful for situations where you want to measure an event with a distinct beginning and end. It should also be used to measure behaviors that you can accurately count and behaviors that only last for a small amount of time. So if you're working with a child who typically gets aggressive for up to 45 minutes, trying to measure how many times they get aggressive in a 3-hour time frame isn't going to give you an accurate picture of behavioral changes throughout a therapy type model. Duration, depending on your goals, the length of time that an action, like a temper tantrum or something, lasts may be a significant benchmark for your strategy. While frequency recording can give you insight into the number of behaviors that happen in a time frame, you might want to know how long a specific behavior lasts, like a temper tantrum. So the duration, allows you to record how long the temper tantrum is lasting. So this method is also useful for behaviors that are too fast, or things that are too much of a variable to count with frequency, like the tantrum, behaviors that are too fast, like chattering your teeth or something like that. You can totally use more than one recording method, when collecting data. So you can use both the frequency as well as the duration to see how long something lasts. The more data you have, obviously, the better you're going to be able to understand the behavior, the better you can come up with some kind of treatment. The duration, you're noting the first time the behavior happens and then note the time that the behavior ends. With the latency to correct negative behaviors and spark positive social change, a therapist might use cues or words to help encourage behaviors. Latency recording involves measuring the time that it takes for a behavior to occur after a verbal cue for that event. For example, you might want to know how long it takes a student to stop talking when you say quiet down. Similarly, you could record how long it takes a student to quiet down after you turn off the lights in a classroom. This method is used for measuring the impact of verbal cues and events. So let's say you're measuring quiet down to help curb a negative social behavior in an extremely talkative child. You'd want to introduce a communication response that helps halt that behavior, teaching that child boundaries. In this case, knowing how long it takes a child to halt or begin behavior at that cue gives you insight into the long-term effectiveness of the strategy. So how to use it would be to issue the verbal cues or events, and then you're recording how long it takes for that behavior to begin or end after the verbal cue has been issued. And then interval recording. All of the data collections, share one thing in common. They require constant attention. So if you're in a situation where you can't constantly pay attention and record behaviors, this can be, challenging to do. But if you're doing research, then, this should be all that you're doing is focusing on your participants, right? Interval recording can be a massive asset if you're struggling to pay attention to everything. In interval recording, the entire observation window is split up into blocks of time. So, the observer, observes whether or not a behavior occurs during the time frame that, they're supposed to be watching. There's a few variations on interval recording, like the whole interval and the partial interval. The primary purpose of interval recording is time constraints. Since like the frequency gives you better overall insights into behavioral patterns, interval recording isn't the strongest behavioral data collection method, but it's one of the easiest to do. So if you're going to use interval recording, you split up an observation into smaller blocks of time, right? So you take day 1 and you split it into 1 minute every hour, 5 minutes every hour, 15 minutes every hour, whatever the blocks of time you want to be. And then you record whether or not a behavior happens during that time that you've got it blocked off. It's always important to minimize bias as much as we possibly can. There's a few techniques that we can try to do to make this happen. Masking is one of them. Masking or binding helps you make sure that both your participants and your observers are unaware of the research aims. This can remove some of the research expectations that come from knowing the study purpose, so observers are less likely to be biased in a particular way. You can implement masking by involving other people in your study, such as observers, and giving them a cover story to mislead them about the true purpose of your study. We also have triangulation, which means using multiple observers, information sources, or research methods to make sure your findings are credible. It's always good to use triangulation to corroborate your measurements and check that they line up with each other. To reduce observer bias, it's especially important to involve multiple observers and try to use multiple data collection methods for the same observations. When the data from different observers or different methods converge, then you reduce the risk of bias and can feel more confident in your results. So, ethnography is a great method that we use to understand how cultures work and affect the people who belong to them. But to do this properly requires detailed observations about what's going on in a particular study. We can conduct ethnographic research in the natural setting of our participants. Researchers must travel to where they are. The field work can be completed by several researchers who specialize in this type of work. If it spans a large sample size or a wide geographical area, they need to make sure that they avoid making judgments about specific cases. They don't judge people on dimensions such as morality or social behavior. Instead, they're just describing their experience of social groups. They don't treat people as objects for data collection, but as subjects or participants who must give their informed consent for such research. They're focused ethnographic methods where only one type of data is collected. For example, if the subject is food eaten in a certain culture, researchers may concentrate on kitchen habits, recipes, and how food is sourced, but nothing else. You can collect demographic data, which includes information about the culture's people. This is where quantitative data can also come into play. Ethnographers need large amounts of data. The more time researchers spend immersed in the subject society, the better understanding they'll have of the culture. And there are some examples here of different types of ethnography and research that we can conduct. So when we do a case study, or sometimes this is a case study methodology, we refer to it as, it gives us kind of a unique opportunity to look at one individual person, one data source, sometimes a small group of people, but generally a case study is just one. It can be qualitative, quantitative, or a mixed methods approach. So we can do either type of research design. Sometimes it can be confusing because the same term is used multiple ways. It can refer to the methodology, which is a system of frameworks used to design a study, or the methods used to conduct it, or a case study can refer to a type of academic writing that typically delves into a problem, process, or a situation. Case study methodology can entail the study of one or more cases that can be described as instances, examples, or settings where the problem or phenomenon can be examined. The researcher is tasked with defining the parameters of the case, and that's what's included and excluded. This process is called bounding the case or setting boundaries. Case study can be combined with other methodologies such as ethnography, grounded theory, phenomenology. In such studies, the research on the case uses another framework to further define the study and refine the approach. Case study is also described as a method given particular approaches used to collect and analyze data. Case study research is conducted by almost every social science discipline: business, education, sociology, psychology. Case study research, with its reliance on multiple sources, is also a natural choice for researchers interested in cross-disciplinary studies. So some types of case studies that we can do in research. The first one here is the illustrative case study. This can be done to examine a familiar case in order to help others understand it. It's one of the main types of case studies in research methodology, and is primarily descriptive. In this type of case study, there's usually one or two instances that are utilized to explain what a situation is like. It aims to give the readers an in-depth, common idea about the topic being treated. When we write such a case study, the idea is to have whoever reads it inclined to the common understanding of the topic. Most times these studies are very objective, such that they do not require a lot of interpretation. They rarely involve humans because it does not, when it does, several variables come into play concerning that subject matter. And then we have the exploratory. This is a summarized method done before executing a full-scale investigation. The main reason for this type of study is to assist in classifying questions and choose measurement parameters before the actual investigation. However, if you're not careful, you may be tempted to make a premature conclusion based on the initial summary. Usually the goal is to show that more investigations will be required and considered necessary. It's very popular in psychological fields. For example, some psychologists may decide to do a study of troopers that come home after active combat. Although the end goal is to identify the cause of PTSD, however, at the very beginning, attention may be put on the veterans themselves to establish PTSD. Typically, these are used to identify research questions and methods for a large and complex study. So we want to, if we do an exploratory case study, it's to help identify situations for the further research process. And then the collective case study, or cumulative case study, it's referred to as. This is one of the main types of case studies that we do in qualitative research. It's used to collect information from different sources at different times in order to come up with a single body of information. The aim of these studies usually is to gather information from past studies and form a greater concrete overview of the topic in question without having to go through the rigorous cost or time being used on fresh studies. An example would be a case where a researcher decides not only to study the Vietnam veterans, but also the ones from World War II and the Persian Gulf veterans. By this, the researcher is able to give a collective study on the concept as a whole and not just fixating just on one place at one time. So we want to summarize the past studies without spending additional time and cost on investigating new things. So it's really a form of data analysis. So we look to do this to, try and develop new theories sometimes, just get a general inquiry of research that's already been out there and been conducted before. So generally, these are qualitative in design, but we can add elements of quantitative data as we discussed. So ultimately, this could be a mixed methods approach.